Good afternoon. Welcome to VISHA 1974 and Iowa State University. This year, for our weekend of entertaining education, VISHA is proud to announce that our first lecture will be by Mr. William F. Buckley, Jr. Born in New York City in 1925, Mr. Buckley is known as the founder and editor of National Review magazine, the host for the television show Firing Line, and is author of the syndicated weekly column On the Right. Following his speech here in CY this afternoon, he will be at the maintenance shop in the Union for a question and answer session with anybody who'd like to talk to him. We urge all of you to attend. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. William F. Buckley, Jr.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Madam Chairman, I'm very happy to be here, particularly as in connection with your annual Bacchanalia. I'm slightly awed to be in the presence of Dr. Atanasov, ignorant as I am of science, appreciative though I am of the encouraging words on the subject of science that he related to us a few moments ago. My only knowledge of the history of science in America is of the young commander in the Navy right after the Civil War, who, having graduated from MIT, attempted to persuade the admiral on maneuver to permit him to install this new device by which, instead of having to bring pails of heated water to the admiral's bathtub in the late afternoon, he would have merely to pull a hose and turn a switch, and hot water would pour in. The admiral was very skeptical and belonged to the irascible naval tradition. He finally consented to the experiment, and on the great day stripped down, got into his bathtub, and confronted the hose that had been installed. The first was one through which he gave orders to the fleet up at the bridge. So the water was in the bathtub, but what was to come out was steam, of course, to heat the water. So he stuck the pipe into the water, and it instantly worked to suck all of the water out. So it is recorded in American naval history that he then pulled the other pipe and bellowed out to the bridge, "Tell that scientific son of a bitch to give me back my water." A century later, he'd have said, "Tell that scientific expletive to give me back my water." I was told earlier on in the day by a hospitable member of the student body, quotes, "Is there anything you want me to tell you about Iowa, such as where it is?" I told him there was no reason to be so self-conscious towards a resident of Connecticut, which in Europe is generally thought of as one of the surviving Indian reservations, for the recognition of which Marlon Brando occasionally struggles. I don't know much about the history of Iowa, but then I don't know much about the history of Connecticut, come to think of it. But I do remember as a school boy reading with considerable admiration of the syntactical resourcefulness of a local mayor in Iowa. It was during the war, and Queen Wilhelmina, whose country was occupied by the Nazis, was in exile, and she came on a triumphant tour, spending the ritual day at Hyde Park and at the White House, and accompanied by a State Department escort officer. She came to a town in Iowa to see the agricultural miracle here, and was being driven around by a mayor who was rather diffident about how to address her, not having had much experience with queens. So at one moment she said, "My gracious," as she was traveling along the car, "Mr. Mayor, that must be the tallest corn in all the world." And he turned to her and he said, "You said a mouthful, Queen." What little I know about protocol, I learned last fall as delegate to the United Nations, which was why I could not accept your kind invitation to come last fall. It being a presidential appointment, it was of course necessary to be checked out by the FBI, all the more vigilantly in what Spiro Agnew has called the post-Watergate age. The FBI in late August called my associate, Bill Rusher, and he groaned over the telephone. He said, "Do we have to go through this again? Because we did it in 1969 when Mr. Buckley went to the USIA." And he said, "Yes. I'm sorry, we do. I have to ask you, has Mr. Buckley done anything since 1969 that might embarrass the Nixon administration?" Mr. Rusher said, "No, but the Nixon administration has done a great deal since 1969 to embarrass Buckley." I promised not to devote my lecture to the United Nations, in which, in any event, I had a tangential contact, it having rather early on been discovered that my speeches are not totally harmonious with the spirit of détente. But many weeks after I got there, I found that I was tapped to speak at an annual event in New York, to which all delegates to the United Nations are invited. It's sponsored by the City of New York, more exactly sponsored by New York City's Commissioner on the United Nations, a tall, distinguished lady who every year stages a large lunch shortly before Election Day, if there is to be an election day that particular year, for the purpose of instructing our foreign guests in, quotes, New York civics. Having discovered that I had run for mayor of New York in 1965, she tapped me, and I went through my paces. And during the question period, one gentleman arose and he said, "Mr. Buckley, what is your opinion of the New York State Transportation Bond issue?" I said, "Well, I had no opinion of it at all, because," I said, I vote in Connecticut, not in New York. Under the circumstances, I spared myself the burden of probing it." So the New York State Commissioner rose and she said, "Mr. Ambassador, you see, in the United States, people vote not where they work, but where they sleep." So I said, "Well, that's not exactly correct, because if I voted where I slept, I would vote in the United Nations." I do not, as I say, intend to discuss with you the United Nations or Watergate or other forms of torture, although I would be glad to answer any questions on the subject during the question period for those of you who care to ask. I do have rather melancholy reflections on another theme, which I think will survive Watergate. And I am sorry if I'm here to make you sad. I think sometimes of the couple who got on very well together except for a hostility between the man and his mother-in-law which festered over the years. And then at one point his wife fell fatally ill, and he said to her, "Is there anything I can do to assuage your dying hours?" And she said, "Yes. You can make me a solemn deathbed promise that when I die you will ride in the same automobile with my mother to the cemetery and back." He said, "Very well, I promise, but let me tell you, it's going to ruin my day." It may be my function to ruin your afternoon, but I know that you have a canoe race at 2:30, and in any case, I promise I will not do to you what Senator Humphrey did to Premier Khrushchev. There may be some people in the room old enough to remember that when in 1959 a reporter from the Associated Press rushed to Senator Goldwater as he came out of the chamber in Washington and said, "Have you any response to the news that's just coming over the ticker that Senator Humphrey has spent 9 hours in continuous conversation with Premier Khrushchev in the Kremlin?" And Goldwater replied that this surely was the nearest America had ever come to massive retaliation. I participated in January in a forum along with Professor John Kenneth Galbraith and Professor Jean-Francois Revel, discussing the virtues and vices of America. Mr. Revel, some of you will recall, wrote a best-selling book a few years ago, tantalizingly entitled "A Future Without Jesus or Marx." Parenthetically, I can understand a future without Marx, but it had always seemed to me that if our future is indeed to be without Jesus, the decision would probably be his, not ours. And that in any event, Jesus is not bound by the deliberations even of best-selling French philosophers. Not that he should disdain them. Jesus desires a good press, even in France, though to be sure he is most often ignored by the press. I have no doubt that the great religious revival in America will occur only after Jack Anderson reveals that on the third day, in fact, Christ arose. Mr. Revel joined Mr. Galbraith in deploring economic assumptions in America, assumptions that would become, or rather had only a year before been, the theme of George McGovern's presidential campaign. But Mr. Revel said that there is in America, quotes, "an increasing rejection of a society motivated by profit, dominated exclusively by economic considerations, ruled by the spirit of competition, and subjected to the mutual aggressiveness of its members." This passage he concluded by saying that beneath every revolutionary idea, we find the conviction that man has become the tool of his tools, and that he must once more become an end and a value in himself. Concerning these comments, a few observations. One, I do not know of any society that is dominated exclusively by economic considerations. I think that what we have been seeing rather is the continuing disposition of many people in America to ascribe an economic motivation to every human transaction. was, after all, only 2 years ago that an organization of militant ladies who called themselves Another Mother for Peace bombarded the Congress of the United States with 400,000 signatures of Americans who protested the Vietnam War after having been advised by that committee that the war was actually being fought on behalf of the oil interests in America. And indeed, it turned out that a report had been circulating among the membership to the effect that U.S. oil companies were poised to take 400 million barrels of oil per day out of the Indo-Chinese shelf, beginning on the week that South Vietnam won its victory. In due course, a congressional committee, after patient investigation, disclosed that 400 million barrels of oil per day is indisputably a lot of oil. In fact, it is 10 times as much oil as is taken daily out of the rest of the entire world combined. That B, the United States owned no oil concessions off Indochina, and C, no oil had been discovered off Indochina. But these clerical corrections, and others like them, did not significantly diminish the ranks of the true believers who continued to contend that the principal motive of the United States in Southeast Asia had been economic. 2, once we have fought our way through the lines of the orthodox economic determinists, whose arguments I think are soft and sloppily deployed, we come upon a superior force which is ethical in nature, suggested by Mr. Ravel's contention that our society, inasmuch as it is motivated by profit, is therefore subjected to the mutual aggressiveness of its members. It is, as many of you know, widely suggested that it was in reaction against such aggressiveness that the great student upheavals of the past few years came. Yet during the most vociferous years in the late 60s, there were student riots not only in Chicago and Berkeley, but in Paris and Madrid, Tokyo and Berlin, New Delhi and Mexico, not to say the whole of China. On and on they came, their geographical coordinates unpredictable, such that the taxonomists finally threw up their instruments in dismay after attempting unsuccessfully to correlate the student dissatisfactions with private enterprise, or for that matter the Vietnam War or racism, which, if you throw in clitoral orgasm, constitute, I suppose, a comprehensive list of the major student concerns of that decade. But the social convulsions, whose reality we cannot dispute, did not so greatly surprise observers whose Richter scales are less easily disturbed than those of the cosmopolitan press. Christopher Dawson and David Reisman, a historian and a sociologist, to name only two of the scholars who come to mind, had long been aware, among so many others, of the phenomenon of what they called anomie, the great fault in human nature, which, like the geophysical faults that cause elemental disturbances beneath the surface of the earth, caused deracinated man and woman to shudder with fright and loneliness and despair. Even so, rejecting the anti-capitalist explanation for student upheavals, I think it is instructive to go ahead and ask why so often, as in the work of Professors Ravel and Galbraith, the thrust of their criticism is lodged against the free marketplace, against the institution of private property. What is it that they prefer? Mr. Galbraith, whose most recent book had only 2 months earlier been reviewed in the New York Times, proclaimed himself in it as a socialist, and no doubt in the book in which he spoke so enthusiastically about the reorganization of China by Mao Zedong, He did so in part because he found Mao's China liberated from the afflictions of the free marketplace. Mind you, in that slim book, he acknowledges the authoritarian character of the regime, but quickly he puts a gloss on it. Dissidents, he writes. That is how he describes Chinese who want to read books they want to read, or who want to change their jobs or leave the country or practice their religion. Dissidents are brought firmly into line in China, but one suspects with great politeness. It is a firmly authoritarian society, he says, in which those in charge smile and say please. In Mr. Galbraith's book, Mao Zedong emerges as a sort of pastoral college president. But focus now narrowly on the economic arrangements in China. Authoritarianism, as we all know, can indeed work marvels. As Mr. Galbraith, ever the wistful former head of the Office of Price Administration during the Second World War, discerns. Listen. In any other country, Mr. Galbraith observes, the difference between urban and rural incomes would set in motion a large movement of people to the cities, and in China it once did. This is not now happening. The reason is straightforward. The Chinese are assigned jobs and remain where they are assigned. And then Professor Galbraith, perhaps the leading cultural critic in America of the free market, gets quite specific. After all, he was in China as an economist, and indeed as president of the American Economic Association. He was traveling there with the two predecessor presidents of that association. And so in one chapter, the great economist strips for action and becomes all professional, like Charles Darwin whipping out his magnifying glass. While the higher authority decides what prices are to be, writes Professor Galbraith about the workings of the municipal marketplace in Peking, such authority is intelligently susceptible to suggestions as to when abundance requires reduction and scarcity an increase. The keeper of the apple stall, whom I consulted informally, told me that, of course, apples were reduced in price as the autumn advanced and the supply became more abundant. Leaping lizards. Reduce the price of apples when they are abundant, increase the price of apples when they are scarce. Score one more thought for Chairman Mao. Now, granted, higher authority, that is the term they use in China, isn't always finely tuned to the vagaries of human nature, to such things as harvest yields and fluctuating tastes and reallocations of still higher authority. And when the highest authority himself makes wrong decisions, well, Professor Tobin, writes Mr. Galbraith about his traveling companion, a former head of the American Economics Association, an economic advisor to the late George McGovern. Professor Tobin observes that there are no dogs or cats in China. The reason, Mr. Galbraith explains, is presumably economic. Quote, if food has been scarce and rationed, affection for a participating pet must diminish. This seems especially probable, he concludes, if the pet is itself edible. Let me tell you something, Professor Galbraith, Professor Revell and Tobin, and anyone else who wants to hear it. The reason for eating one's pet dog isn't economic. It is biological. It is the assertion of biological need over economic choice. And it is to such biological compulsions that the Chinese were recently driven by higher authority. And when higher authority, assuming the mantle of the marketplace, makes miscalculations so serious that not even great politeness serves to bring dissidents into line, why then the muzzle of a gun becomes the only relevant article in the marketplace, and the supply of guns in China never fluctuates with the seasons. But by that time, my friend Mr. Galbraith has finished his brief passage in China and is back now in America, preaching the anachronism of the free marketplace and the price system, and dealing with his own dissenters, not always with great politeness. Perhaps Samuel Johnson went too far when he remarked 200 years ago that man is seldom so innocently engaged as when in pursuit of profit. But I confess to being more shaken by the complementary proposition that the free marketplace introduces mutual aggressiveness. Surely that, not Johnson's, is the climactic effrontery. The notion that it is an act of aggression to lay before the individual a choice, whether of canned soups or of economic textbooks or of colleges or of newspapers. By that token, it is even an act of aggression to write another song, or paint a canvas, or set down a fresh verse, or write a judicial opinion on the grounds that by doing so we muscle into territory already spoken for. The ethical case against the free marketplace retreats, but leaves us three, facing the entrenched positions of the critics of our society whose complaint is against the dehumanization of Western economic arrangements, as summarized by Professor Ravel's conclusion that over here, man has become the tool of his tools, ceasing to be an end and a value in himself, and reminding us that the search of our revolutionist is for the restoration of the individual as once again an end and a value in himself. I myself view the mechanization of the individual as the principal commitment of the secularists of this world who have lost hold of the metaphysical arguments, the arguments that argue the dignity of man, leaving them with a philosophy of positivism to which they now conjoin with great facility a phenomenological opportunism. I remember it was only 10 years ago an analysis touching on the quick of the problem done by a stylish young intellectual who put it this way to his audience. Once upon a time, he said, it was worth running the risk of dying for two reasons. The first was that heroism was rewarded in another world. The second was that heroism was rewarded in the memory of man who built the foundations of freedom upon the sacrifices of others. But now, he said, now that we know from the scientific evidence that there is in fact no other world, no future world, no transcendent heaven, and now that we have invented weapons that are capable of destroying all of mankind, and therefore all of human energy along with it, what is the reason left for heroism, for war, or even for the risk of war, he asks. And one can see that the cutting edges of the argument are nowadays stressed, some of you will have noticed, not so much as they did a few years ago, the nuclear war that would abolish mankind, as they do, slowly, the senselessness of any war, the senselessness even of the threat of war, indeed, derivatively, the senselessness of a convincing army, navy, and air force. Tools of our tools. Why, they ask, in effect, what is the justifying point of an armed service in a nuclear age? It seems to me, finding oneself in such a polemical corner, one had traditionally only to reach into one's arsenal as Patrick Henry once did and pull out the arrow that has freedom written on it and touch it down on the skeptic, and he would waste away like a witch, come in contact with water. You will have noticed it doesn't work anymore because freedom, particularly in the academies, is increasingly accepted as a condition describable only by arbitrary postulation. Professor Ross Terrell of Harvard, author of the two most influential articles that appeared in our time on the subject of Red China, articles that were avidly read by the President of the United States and all of the press who accompanied him to Peking 2 years ago, is to be distinguished from the famous apologists of Stalin's Russia, who made their way by simply denying the crimes imputed to Stalin during the 30s and 40s. Terrell denies nothing. He doesn't disguise the condition of the state of freedom in China today, not for a minute. After informing us that in China there is no freedom to practice religion, nor to vote, nor to express oneself freely, nor to read books or periodicals one desires to read, nor to join a labor union, nor to change one's job, nor to travel to another city or another country, he notes ingenuously. People ask me, is China free? He answers with great difficulty. Depends what you mean by freedom, he said. Freedom is always defined, he reminds us, with reference to the relevant entity. In the West, it happens to be the individual. In China, it happens to be the whole state. He illustrates. Consider the writer, Kuo Mojo. In the 30s, he wrote books for a mere 4 or 5 or at most 8,000 people, books he wanted to write. Now he is required by the state to write only books that will appeal to 20, 30, or 50 million people. Is that wrong, the Harvard professor asks. Then there is the researcher at Peking University, whose affinity has been for abstract science, but who was recently directed by the state to concentrate all of his time on pest control. Is that wrong? Terrell asks once again. And I think we begin to understand the phenomenon. The ideological egalitarianism that rushes in after practical diplomacy are such that Richard Nixon, who went to China to establish a dialogue with Mao Zedong, ended by likening Mao's revolution to George Washington's revolution, ended by proclaiming that we would have a, quote, long march together, as if to say that Mao, too, is entitled to his Via Dolorosa. Why should we not ecumenically share our own with him? Where is Vatican III? And there is Mr. Nixon, seated next to Madame Mao Zedong, watching resignedly in the little chamber ballet in Peking, anti-communist, or anti-capitalist ballet become agitprop, a violation of art as well as of manners. It was as though we had invited the presidents of the black African republics to the White House, there to show them a ballet on the theme of Little Black Sambo. And Mr. Nixon, returning to the United States, proclaiming at Andrews Air Force Base the great enthusiasm the Chinese people feel for their government. Indeed, the Chinese have done much to illustrate ways of generating enthusiasm for their government, and no doubt Mr. Nixon is professionally fascinated by them. But we see through him the movement of Western opinion. What really is so bad about Red China? Their ways are not our ways, to be sure, but is it seriously proposed that we should be prepared to die, if necessary, in order to avoid living by their word rather than by our own, which is in any case corrupt, racist, decadent, and above all, materialist? The ongoing search for a new American revolution that would restore meaning to the individual is up against the two melancholy precedents of this century. Two great revolutions whose extirpative passion, however, proved to be the elimination of the individual. And indeed we note that the revolutionary rhetoric of the day pays only formalistic attention to the individual, preferring to appeal to, quote, the people. Indeed, principled, metaphysical defenses of man are somehow, have you noticed, just a little embarrassing, irrelevant. Even Whittaker Chambers, the most eloquent counter-revolutionist in the post-war era, would make gentle scorn of the inflexible defenders of the individual, of the late Mr. Frank Meyer, for instance, whose implacable book, which he called In Defense of Freedom, was current when the Republicans suffered their great congressional defeat of 1958. If the Republican Party does not find a way to appeal to the mass of the people, Chambers wrote me at that time, it will find itself voted into singularity. It will become then something like the little shop you see in the crowded parts of great cities, in which no business is done or expected. You enter it and find an old man in the rear fingering for his own pleasure oddments of cloth, caring not at all if he sells any. As your eyes become accustomed to the gas light, you are only faintly surprised to discover that the old man is Frank Meyer. I submit to the critics of American society that if they are truly concerned about the survival of the individual, they should focus on that individual, or focus on those oddments of cloth, by a familiarity with which a few men and women know to hesitate not at all when someone asks the question, is it wrong for the state to tell the writer what to write? Is it wrong for the state to tell the scientist what to study? Those few who do not hesitate to answer, yes, it is wrong, it was always wrong, it is now wrong, and will forever be wrong. The old man with the oddment of cloth is fingering some of the great truths that enable us to penetrate the sophistries by which we are somehow persuaded that we can serve the individual by moving against the principal institution, the marketplace, through which the individual asserts what freedom of movement our modern social architects have left him with, or that we can make a profitable philosophical beginning by revolutionarily renouncing the religion which tells us, in the words of Ecclesiastes, that God has made man upright. The subject is strangely, quietly saddening as we meet here to discuss the free marketplace in Russia. The people crowd to the only free marketplace left. It is the black market, and pay their 80 rubles, a month's wages, for a single novel by Solzhenitsyn. And there in Russia, whose rulers denounced the marketplace 50 years ago with a blaze of trumpets and a rain of bullets aimed righteously at the temples of teenage girls and the hemophiliac boy in a cellar in Central Asia, there in Russia, 50 years after the advent of socialism, there are old men and old women and young men and young women who transcribe by hand, not for profit, from Radio Liberty, risking prison by the very act of listening to it, the latest novel of Solzhenitsyn, word after word, sentence after sentence, page after page, a process that takes them weeks and months to complete, resulting not in thousands, let alone millions of copies, but in a few dozen or perhaps a few hundred, the oddments of cloth. But it is worth it, worth everything to preserve those oddments, to make them available to those who are graced with a thirst for them. The books of Solzhenitsyn accumulate, even as the disdain for the institutes of freedom perversely accumulates, for an understanding of which paradox we find no help at all in Marx, but considerable help in Jesus, whose servant Paul observed that though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day.
Again, we'd like to remind you that Mr. Buckley will be in the maintenance shop now, and also that the canoe races will start on Lake Laverne at 2:30. Thank you all for coming.